Chapter 5 The Roundup. It was a crackling and roaring fire that awoke Madeline next morning, and the first thing she saw was a huge stone fireplace in which lay a bundle of blazing sticks. Somebody had kindled the fire while she had slept. For a moment, the curious sensation of being lost returned to her. She was just dimly remembering reaching the ranch and being taken into a huge house and a huge, dimly lit room. And it seemed to her that she had gone to sleep at once and had awoken without remembering how she even got to bed. But she was wide awake in an instant, and the bed stood near one end of an enormous chamber. The adobe walls resembled a hall in an ancient feudal castle, stone-floored, stone-walled with great, darkened rafters running along the ceiling. The few articles of furniture were worn out and sadly dilapidated. Light flooded into the room from two windows on the right of the fireplace and two on the left, and another large window near the bedstead. Looking out from where she lay, Madeline saw a dark, slow-up sweep of a mountain. Her eyes returned to the cheery, snapping fire, and she watched it while gathering courage to get up. The room was cold. When she did slip her bare feet out upon the stone floor, she very quickly put them back under the warm blankets. And she was still in bed trying to gather up her courage when a knock on the door and a cheerful greeting. Florence entered, carrying a steaming hot water.
"Good morning, Miss Hammond. Hope you slept well. You sure were tired last night. I imagine you'll find this old ranch house as cold as a barn. It'll warm up directly. Al's gone with the boys and Bill. We're to ride down to the range after a while when your baggage comes."
Florence wore a woolen blouse with a scarf round her neck, a short corduroy divided skirt, and boots, and while she talked, she energetically heaped up the burning wood in the fireplace and laid Madeline's clothes at the foot of the bed and heated a rug and put that on the floor by the bedside. And lastly, with a sweet, delicate smile, she said,
"Al told me, and I sure saw myself, that you weren't used to being without a maid. Would you let me help you?" "Thank you. I'm going to be my own maid for a while, and I expect I do appear a very helpless individual, but really, I do not feel so. Perhaps I have had too much waiting on. All right, breakfast will be ready soon, and after that, we'll go look around the place."
Madeline was charmed with the old Spanish house, and the more she saw of it, the more she thought what a delightful home it could be. All the doors opened into a courtyard or a patio, as Florence called it. The house was low, in the shape of a rectangle, and so immense in size that Madeline wondered if it had once been a Spanish barracks. Many of the rooms were dark, without windows, and they were empty. Others were full of ranchers' implements and sacks of grain or bales of hay. Florence called these last alfalfa. The house itself appeared strong and well preserved, and it was picturesque. But in the living rooms were only the barest necessities, and those were worn out and comfortless. Moreover, when Madeline went outdoors, she forgot the cheerless, bare interior. Florence led the way out on the porch and waved a hand at a vast, colored void. "That's what Bill likes," she said. At first, Madeline could not tell what was sky and what was land. The immensity of the scene stunned her faculties of conception. She sat down in one of the old rocking chairs and looked, and knew that she was not grasping the reality of what stretched wondrously before her.
"We're on the edge of the foothills," Florence said. "You remember when we rode around the northern end of the mountain range? Well, that's behind us now, and you look down across the line into Arizona and Mexico. That long slope of gray is the head of the San Bernardino Valley. Straight across you see the black Chicarales Mountains, and way down to the south the Guadalupe Mountains. That awful red gulf between is the desert, and far, far beyond the dim blue peaks are the Sierra Madres in Mexico.
Madeline listened and gazed with straining eyes, and wondered if it was only a stupendous mirage, and why it seemed so different from all else she had seen before, so endless, so baffling, and so grand.
"It sure'll take you a little while to get used to being up high and seeing so much," explained Florence. "That's the secret. We're up high and the air is clear, and there's the whole bare world before us. Doesn't it somehow give you some rest? Well, it will. Now, see those specks in the valley? Those are stations, little towns. The railroad goes down that way. The largest speck is Chihuahua. It's over 40 miles by trail. Here, round to the north, you can see Don Carlos Ranch. He's 15 miles off, and I sure wish he were 1,000. That little green square about halfway between here and Don Carlos, that's Al's ranch. Just below us are the adobe houses of the Mexicans. And there's a church, too. And here to the left you can see Stillwell's corrals and bunkhouses and his stables all falling to pieces. The ranch has gone to ruin. All the ranches are going to ruin, but most of them are little one-horse affairs. See that cloud down in the valley? That's the roundup. The boys are there and the cattle. Wait, I'll get the glasses."
By their aid, Madeline saw in the foreground a great, dense herd of cattle, with dark, thick streams and dotted lines of cattle heading in every direction. She saw streaks and clouds of dust, running horses, and a band of horses grazing, and she described horsemen standing still like sentinels, and others in action.
"The roundup. I want to know all about it, to see it," declared Madeline. "Please tell me more." "It sure is a sight, Miss Hammond. I'll be glad to take you down, but I'd fancy you not want to get too close. Few Eastern people who regularly eat their choice cuts of roast beef and porterhouse have any idea of open range and the struggle cattle have to live and the hard lives of cowboys. It'll really open up your eyes, Miss Hammond. I'm glad that you care to know, though. Your brother would have made a big success in this cattle business if it had not been for crooked work by rival ranchers. He'll make it yet, in spite of them." "Indeed he shall," replied Madeline. "But tell me, please, again, tell me more about the roundup." "Well, in the first place, every cattleman has to have a brand to identify his stock. Without a brand, no cattleman, or half 100 cowboys, if he had so many, could ever recognize all the cattle in a big herd. There's no fences on our ranges. They're all open to everybody. Some day I hope we'll be rich enough to fence a range. Different herds graze together. Each calf has to be caught, if possible, and branded with the mark of its mother. It's no easy job. A maverick is an unbranded calf that's been weaned and shifts by itself. The maverick then belongs to the man who finds it and brands it. These little calves, they lose their mothers, sure have some cruel time of it. Many of them often die, though. Then the coyotes and wolves and lions, they prey upon them. Every year we have 2 big roundups, but the boys do some branding all the year. A calf should be branded as soon as it's found. It is a safeguard against cattle thieves. We don't have the rustling of herds and bunching of cattle like we used to, but there's always the calf thief, and always will be as long as there's cattle raising. The thieves have a good many cunning tricks. They kill the calf's mother or slit the calf's tongue so it can't suck, and then it loses its mother. They steal or hide a calf and watch it till it's big enough to fare for itself, and then they brand it. They make imperfect brands and finish them at a later time. We also have our big roundup in the fall, where there's plenty of grass and water, and all the riding stock as well as the cattle are in fine shape. The cattlemen in the valley meet with their cowboys and drive all the cattle they can find. Then they brand and cut out each man's herd and drives it towards home. Then they go on up or down the valley and make another camp and drive in more cattle. It takes weeks. There are so many greasers with little bands of stock, and they're crafty and greedy. Bill says he knows greaser cowboys, or vaqueros, who never owned a steer or a cow, but now they're growing herds. The same might be said of more than one white cowboy, but there's not as much of that as there used to be, though. And the horses? Tell me about them, Madeline asked when Florence paused. Oh, the cow ponies! Well, those are sure interesting. Broncos, the boys call them. They're wild. Wilder than the steers they have to chase. Bill got broncos that he's never had broke or never will be. Not every boy can ride them either. The vaqueros have the finest horses of the bunch. Don Carlos has a black that I'd give anything to own, and he has some other fine stockers too. Gene Stewart's big roan is a Mexican horse, the swiftest and proudest I ever saw. I was up on him once, and man, can he run. He likes women too, and that's sure something I want in a horse. I heard Al and Bill talking at breakfast about a horse for you. They were wrangling. Bill wanted you to have one, and Al wanted you to have a different. It's funny to hear them. Finally, they left the choice to me until the roundup is over. Then I suppose every cowboy in the range will offer his best mount. Come on, let's go out to the corrals and look over some horses. For Madeline, the morning hours flew by, with a goodly part of the time spent on the porch, gazing out over that ever-changing vista. At noon, a teamster drove up with her trunks. Then, while Florence helped the Mexican women get lunch, Madeline unpacked part of her effects and got out things for which she would have immediate need. After lunch, she changed her dress for a riding habit and, going outside, found Florence waiting with the horses. The Western girl's clear eyes seemed to take stock of Madeline's appearance in one swift, inquisitive glance, and then shone with pleasure. You sure look a picture, Miss Hammond. That riding outfit is a new one. What it would look like on me or another woman I can't imagine, but on you, it's stunning. Bill won't let you go within a mile of the cowboys. If they see you, that'll be the finish of the roundup. While they rode down the slope, Florence talked about the open ranges of New Mexico and Arizona. Water's scarce, she said. If Bill could afford to pipe water down from the mountains, he would have the finest ranch in the mountain. She went on to tell that the climate was mild in winter and hot in summer. Warm, sunshiny days prevailed nearly all the year round. Some summers it rained, and occasionally there would be a dry year, the dreaded ano seco of the Mexicans. Rain was always expected and prayed for in the midsummer months, and when it came, the gamma grass sprang up, making the valleys green from mountain to mountain. The intersecting valleys ranging between the long slopes of foothills afforded the best pasture for cattle, and these were jealously sought by the Mexicans who only had small herds to look after. Stillwell's cowboys were always chasing vaqueros off land that belonged to Stillwell. He owned 20,000 acres of unfenced land adjoining on to the open range. Don Carlos possessed more acreage than that, and his cattle were always mingling with Stillwell's. And in turn, Don Carlos vaqueros were always chasing Stillwell's cattle away from the Mexicans' watering place. Bad feeling had been manifested for years, and now relations were strained almost to a breaking point. As Madeline rode along, she made good use of her eyes. The soil was sandy and porous, and she understood why the rain and water from the few springs disappeared so quickly. At a little distance, the gamma grass appeared thick, but near at hand it was seen to be sparse. Bunches of greasewood and cactus plants were interspersed here and there on the grass. What surprised Madeline was the fact that, though she and Florence had seemed to be riding quite a while, they had not appeared to draw any closer to the roundup. The slope of the valley was noticeable only after some miles had been traveled.
Looking forward, Madeline imagined the valley only a few miles wide. She would have been sure she could walk the horse across it in an hour. Yet that black, bold range of the Chicarala Mountains was a distance of a long day's journey for even a hard-riding cowboy. It was only by looking back that Madeline could grasp the true relations of things. She could not believe the distance that she had covered. Gradually the black dots enlarged and assumed shape of cattle and horses moving round a great dusty patch. In another half hour Madeline rode behind Florence to the outskirts of the scene of the action. They drew rein near a huge wagon in the neighborhood, of which were more than 100 horses grazing and whistling and trotting about, lifting heads to watch the newcomers. 4 cowboys stood mounted guard over this drove of horses. Perhaps a quarter of a mile farther out was a dusty melee. A roar of trampling hooves filled Madeline's ears. The line of marching cattle had merged into a great moving herd, half obscured by dust.
"I can only make out a little what's going on," said Madeline. "I want to get closer."
They trotted across half the intervening distance, and when Florence halted again, Madeline was still not satisfied and asked to be taken closer. This time, before they reined in again, Al Hammond saw them and wheeled his horse in their direction. He yelled something which Madeline could not understand, and then halted. "Close enough," he called, and in the din his voice was not very clear. "It's not safe. There's wild steers. I'm glad you came, girls. Majesty, what do you think of these cattle?" Madeline could scarcely reply what she thought, for the dust and noise and ceaseless action confused her.
"They're milling around, Al."
"We're just rounding them up. They're milling, and that's bad. The vaqueros, they're hard drivers. They beat us all hollow, and we drove some too." He was wet with sweat and black with dust and out of breath. "I gotta get going, Flo. My sister will have enough of this in about 2 minutes. Take her back to the wagon. I'll tell Bill you're here and run in whenever I get a minute." The bawling and bellowing, the crackling of horns and pounding of hooves, the dusty whirl of cattle, and the flying cowboys disconcerted Madeline and frightened her a little, but she was intensely interested. It meant to stay here until she saw for herself what that strife of sound and action meant. When she tried to take in the whole scene, she did not make out anything clearly, and she determined it little by little.
"Did you want to stay longer?"
asked Flo, and received an affirmative reply. She warned Madeline.
"If a runaway steer or angry cow comes this way, you just let your horse go. He'll get out of the way."
That lent the situation excitement, and Madeline became absorbed. The great mass of cattle seemed to be eddying about like a whirlpool, and from that Madeline understood the significance of the range word milling. But when Madeline looked at one end of the herd, she saw cattle standing still, facing outward, calves clinging close in fear. The motion of the cattle slowed from the inside of the herd to the outside and gradually ceased. The roar and the tramp of hooves and crackling of the horns and thumps of heads also ceased in degree, but the bawling and bellowing continued. While she watched, the herd spread, growing less dense, and stragglers appeared to be about to bolt through the line of mounted cowboys. From that moment, so many things happened, and so swiftly that Madeline could not have seen a tenth of what was going on within eyesight. It seemed horsemen darting into the herd and drove out cattle. Madeline pinned her gaze upon one cowboy who rode a white horse and was chasing a steer. He whirled a lasso about his head and threw it. The rope streaked out and the loop caught the leg of the steer. The white horse stopped with a wonderful suddenness, and the steer slid into the dust. Quick as a flash, the cowboy was out of the saddle, and grasping the legs of the steer before it could rise, he tied them with a rope. It had been almost done almost as quickly as a thought. Another man came with what Madeline divined was a branding iron. He applied it to the flank of the steer, and then it seemed the steer was up with a jump, wildly looking for some way to run, and the cowboy was circling his lasso. Madeline saw fires in the background with a man in charge evidently heating the irons. Then this same cowboy roped a heifer which was bawling lustfully when the hot iron sheared its hide. Madeline saw the smoke rising from the touch of the iron, and the sight made her shrink and want to turn away, but she was resolute and fought her sensitiveness. She had never been able to bear the sight of any animal suffering. The hard work in men's life was as a sealed book to her, and now, for some reason beyond her knowledge, she wanted to see and hear and learn some of the everyday duties that made up those lives.
"Look, Miss Hammond, there's Don Carlos," said Florence. "Look at that black horse."
Madeline saw a dark-faced Mexican riding by. He was too far away for her to distinguish his features, but he reminded her of an Italian bigred. He was astride a magnificent horse. Stillwell rode up to the girls then and greeted them in his big voice.
"Right in the thick of it, eh? Well, that's sure fine. I'm glad to see, Miss Majesty, that you ain't afraid of a little dust nor the smell of burning of hair and hide."
"Couldn't you brand the calves without hurting them?"
asked Madeline.
"Well, they aren't hurting none. They just bawl for their mamas. Sometimes, though, we have to hurt one just to find which one is his ma, though."
"I want to know how you tell what brand to put on those calves that are separated from their mothers," asked Madeline.
"That there's decided by the roundup bosses. I'm one of the bosses, and Don Carlos another. They decide everything, and they have to be obeyed. That there's Nick Steele, my boss. You watch him. He's riding a bay in amongst the cattle there. He orders the calves and steers to be cut out. Then the cowboys, they go cutting out and do the branding. We try to divide up the mavericks as near as possible."
At this juncture, Madeline's brother joined the group, evidently in search of Stillwell. "Bill, Nels just rode in."
"Good, we sure need 'em. Any news of Danny Maines?"
"No. Nels said he lost the trail when he got onto hard ground."
Well, well. Say, Al, your sister's sure taken to the roundup. And the boys, they'll be getting wise. See that son of a gun there, Amos, cutting capers all around? He's sure doing his prettiest. Amos there, he's a ladies' man, he thinks."
The two men and Florence joined in a little pleasant teasing of Madeline, and drew her attention to what appeared to be really unnecessary feats of horsemanship, all made in her vanity. The cowboys evinced their interest in covert glances while recoiling a lasso or while passing to and fro. It was all too serious for Madeline to be amused at the moment. She did not care to talk. She just sat her horse and watched. The lithe, dark vaqueros fascinated her. They were here, they were there, they were everywhere, with larettes flying and horses plunging back, jerking calves and yearlings to the grass. They were cruel to their mounts, cruel to their cattle. Madeline winced as the great silver rowels of their spurs went plowing into the flanks of their horses. She saw those spurs stained with blood, choked with hair. She saw the vaqueros breaking the legs of calves and let them lie till a white cowboy came along and then shot them. Calves were jerked down and dragged many yards. Steers were pulled by one leg. Those vaqueros were the most superb horsemen Madeline had ever seen, and she'd seen the Corsairs and the Tartars of the Russian steppes. They were swift, graceful, and daring. They never failed to catch a running steer, and the lassos always ran true. with sharp dashes the horses made, and wheeling here and there in the sudden stops, and how they braced themselves to withstand the shock. The cowboys, likewise, showed wonderful horsemanship, and reckless as they were, Madeline imagined she saw a consideration for steed and the cattle that was wanting in the vaqueros. They changed mounts oftener than the Mexican riders, and the horses they unsaddled for fresh ones were not so spent, so wet, and so covered with lather. It was only after an hour or more of observation that Madeline began to realize the exceeding toilsome and dangerous work cowboys had to perform. There was little to no rest for them. They were continually, always, among the wild and vicious and wild-horned steers. In many instances they owed their lives to their horses. The danger came mostly when the cowboy leapt off to tie and brand a steer he had thrown. Some of the cows charged with lowered, twisting horns. Time and again Madeline's heart leapt in her throat for fear a man would be gored. One cowboy roped a calf that bawled loudly. Its mother dashed in and just missed the kneeling cowboy as he rolled over. Then he had to run, and he could not run very fast. He was bow-legged and appeared kind of awkward. Madeline saw another cowboy thrown and nearly run over by a plunging steer. His horse bolted, as if intending to leave the range, and then, close by Madeline, a big steer went down at the end of a lasso. The cowboy who had thrown it nimbly jumped down, and in that moment his horse began to rear and prance, and suddenly to lower his head close to the ground and kick high. He ran round in a circle, the fallen steer on the tight rope acting as a pivot. The cowboy loosened the rope from the steer, and then was dragged about on the grass. It was almost frightful for Madeline to see that cowboy go to his horse, but she recognized the mastery and the skill. Then two horses came into a collision on the run. One horse went down, the rider of the other was unseated and was kicked before he could get up. This fella limped to his mount and kicked at him, while the horse showed his teeth in a vicious attempt to bite. All the while this ceaseless activity was going on, there was a strange uproar, bawl and bellow, the shock of heavy bodies meeting and falling, the shrill jabbering of the vaqueros, and the shouts and the banterings of the cowboys. They took sharp orders and replied in jest. They went about this stern toil as if it were a game to be played in good humor. One sang a song, another whistled, another smoked a cigarette. The sun was hot, and they, like their horses, were dripping with sweat. The characteristics of their red faces were taking on so much dust that the cowboys could not be distinguished from vaqueros except from the difference in dress. Blood was not wanting on tireless hands. The air was thick, oppressive, and rank with the smell of cattle and of burning hide. Madeline began to sicken. She choked with dust and was almost stifled by the odor. But that made her all the more determined to stay there. Florence urged her to come away or at least move back out of the worst of it. Stillwell seconded Florence. Madeline, however, refused. Then her brother said, "Here, this'll make you sick. You're pale." And then she replied that she intended to stay until the day's work ended. Al gave her a strange look, and then made no more comment. The kindly Stillwell then began to talk.
"His Majesty, you're seeing the life of the cowman and the cowboy. It's the real thing, same as it was in the early days. The ranchers in Texas and some in Arizona have took on style and new fandangled ideas that are good, and I wish we could follow them. But we gotta stick to the old-fashioned open-range roundup. I know it looks cruel to you, I can see that. And, well, maybe so, maybe so. Them greasers, though, they are cruel, that's for certain. For that matter, I never saw a greaser who wasn't cruel. But I reckon all the strenuous work you've seen today ain't any tougher than most any day of a cowboy's life. Long hours on horseback, and poor grub sleeping on the ground, lonesome watches, and dust and sun, wind and thirst, day in and day out, all the year round. That's what a cowboy has to look forward to. Look at Nels there. See what little hair he has? That there's Snow White. He's red and thin and hard and burned up. You see that hump on his shoulders and his hands. When he gets close, you just take a peep at them there hands. Nels, he couldn't pick up a pin. He couldn't hardly button his shirt nor untie a knot in his rope. He looks 60 years old man. Well, Nels ain't seen 40. He's a young man, but he's seen a lifetime for every year. Miss Majesty, it was Arizona that made Nels what he is. The Arizona desert and the work of the cowman. He's seen riding in Canyon Diablo. I know every mile of range in every Pocono country. He's ranged from Tombstone to Douglas, and he's shot bad white men and bad greasers before he was 21. He's seen some life, Nels has. My 60 years ain't nothing. My early days in the Staked Plains and on the border with Apaches ain't nothing to what Nels has seen and lived through. He's just come to be part of the desert. You might say he's stone and fire and silence and cactus and force. That there's a man, Miss Majesty, a wonderful man. Rough he seems to you, though. Well, I'll show you pieces of quartz from the mountains back at the ranch, and they're that rough that'll cut your hands, but that there's pure gold in them. And so it is with Nels and many of these cowboys. And over there, that's Prince, Monty Prince. Monty stands for Montana, where he hails from. You take a look at him, Miss Majesty. He's been hurt, I reckon. That accounts for him being without horse or rope and that limp. Well, he's been ripped up a little. It's sure rare and seldom that a cowboy gets foul of one of them thousands of sharp hooves, but it does happen.
Madeline saw a short, wizened little man that was ludicrously bow-legged with a face that color and hardness of burned-out cinder. He was hobbling by towards the wagon, and one of his short, crooked legs dragged.
Not much to look at, is he? Went on Stillwell. Well, I know it's natural. That's what we all best pleased by good looks as anyone, even a man. It ain't had ought to be that way. Monty Prince, he looks like hell, but appearances are deceiving. Monty, he saw years of riding along the Missouri bottoms, the big prairies where there's high grass and sometimes fire. In Montana they have blizzards that freeze cattle standing in their tracks, and horses, they freeze to death too. They tell me that driving sleet in the face with that mercury 40 blow is something to write against. You can't get Monty to say much about the cold. All you have to do is watch him, know how he hunts for the sun. Never gets too hot for Monty. Well, I reckon he was a little more prepossessed once. That story that come to us about Monty's this. He got caught out in a prairie fire and could have saved himself easy, but there was a lone ranch right in the line of fire, and Monty knowed the rancher was away and his wife and baby was alone. He knowed, too, the way the wind was, that the ranch house would burn. It was a long chance he was taking, but he went over and put that woman up behind him, wrapped the baby up in his horse, laid out with a wet blanket, and he rode away. That was some ride, I heard, but the fire catched Monty at last. The woman fell and was lost, and then his horse. Monty ran and walked and crawled through the fire with that baby, and he saved it. Monty was never much good as a cowboy after that. Couldn't hold no jobs. Well, you'll have one with me as long as I have a steer left, though. End of chapter 5.